SeaMan, Chapter 2, Getting Ready. August 31st, 1803 through May 1804. SeaMan stood beside Meriwether Lewis aboard the keelboat, watching the men pull on the oars. The river was low and the keelboat large and bulky, so traveling down the Ohio River was hard work. The hot sun beat down on SeaMan's back. He panted, his tongue hanging out of his mouth. Suddenly, SeaMan raised his head and sniffed. He wolfed, trotted past the boat's captain to the front of the keelboat, and stared at the water. Meriwether Lewis followed, curious about what his dog had discovered. Up ahead, the water's surface seemed to be covered with furry gray balls, each moving above its own small, sleek wave. Lewis brushed his hair out of his eyes. "Look at that," he said to the men rowing the boat. "Why, those are squirrels! Dozens and dozens, no, hundreds of gray squirrels are swimming across the river." SeaMan pranced back and forth eagerly. "All right, SeaMan," Lewis said, smiling. "Get 'em!" Lewis tapped SeaMan's broad back. The dog needed no further urging. With a leap, he splashed into the river. The boat's crew laughed as SeaMan hit the water. On land, the big Newfoundland's thick black coat looked bulky, but in water, he was as sleek and graceful as a seal. His powerful legs stroking, SeaMan swam into the mass of squirrels and caught one in his jaws. He tossed his head and jerked the squirrel's body into the air, snapping its neck. Then he turned toward the keelboat and swam against the river's current with the limp gray body in his mouth. When he reached the boat, he raised his chin and paddled in place while Lewis leaned over the side and took the squirrel. Instantly, SeaMan turned and swam back toward the squirrels. SeaMan repeated the performance again and again. A heap of damp squirrels soon filled the prow of the keelboat. "That's a fine dog," called John Coulter, a lean, muscular member of the crew. He looked at Lewis, a grin on his suntanned face. "Have you ever tasted squirrel meat, Captain?" Lewis shook his head no. Makes mighty good eating," Coulter said. "Back in Kentucky, we used to hunt squirrel. The meat's lean and tasty. Makes my mouth water just thinking about the smell of squirrel meat frying in the pan." The men pulled on their oars eagerly, thinking of the evening supper. "All this game out here." Lewis shook his head as he gazed out over the broad expanse of water. "I've never even heard of squirrels migrating across a river." SeaMan swam back to the boat, and Lewis knelt down to take a squirrel from his mouth. Before the dog turned to continue hunting, Lewis said, "That's enough, SeaMan." He reached out to pull the dog onto the boat. Coulter ran over to help. The big dog scrambled aboard and shook his long coat. Water sprayed everywhere, and the men ducked. Grinning, Coulter brushed off his face with his sleeve. "SeaMan's a great hunting dog, Captain. Eager to please. Happy to work." Lewis agreed. SeaMan's willingness to hunt was one more proof he was the right dog for the coming journey. That evening in camp, SeaMan lay beside Lewis, facing a blazing fire. Lewis bit into a piece of fried squirrel meat, and the men watched him chew. "It's delicious," he declared. The men whooped and dug in. Lewis fed a piece to SeaMan, who swallowed the morsel in a big gulp. Another man laughed and held out a piece from his plate. SeaMan hesitated, looking at Lewis. The dog's furry ears were cocked, and skinny strings of drool hung from his lips. Lewis nodded. Instantly, SeaMan scrambled to his feet. He wiggled his way around the fire, collecting hunks of meat and pats from the men. When SeaMan reached John Coulter, he gobbled up the meat, then licked Coulter's ear. "That's all right, fellow," Coulter said, laughing. "No need to thank me. You earned the squirrel meat." Lewis watched his men play with the dog. Lewis had commanded soldiers, and he knew that a dog reminds men of home, of campfires shared with their fathers, brothers, and childhood friends. SeaMan could take the chill out of the black nights better than a fire. Lewis watched as his men grinned and patted the big dog. He smiled as SeaMan licked their faces and nuzzled their hands. It was only September, and the Ohio River was carrying Lewis and his men to the frontier, the edge of the white settlements. This trip down the Ohio River was really a preparation, a time to hire the men, pack supplies, and make plans. The expedition to the west would begin the following spring. In 1804, first, the group would spend the winter in training near St. Louis, the farthest major settlement in the western United States. After St. Louis, there were a few small settlements, some trading posts, and wilderness that stretched farther than any United States citizen had traveled, farther than most Americans could imagine. Lewis knew that blacker, chillier nights would come. As explorers, they were going to face unknown dangers. The expedition would take a year or two to reach the Pacific Ocean and return. When the men felt scared or homesick, the dog would help lift their spirits. Along the banks of the Ohio, the countryside was mostly forest. Trees lined the riverbanks, their leaves still green and lush. Days fell into a routine. The men awoke with the sun and ate a breakfast of leftovers from yesterday's supper. They broke camp, pushed off the boats, and proceeded on their journey. The group rowed downstream each day, struggling to move the heavy wooden keelboat through the shallow waters. Sometimes it snagged, and the men had to lift or drag it into deeper water. River travel on a keelboat was hard work, but it was necessary because the big vessel could be packed with several tons of supplies. The keelboat had a cabin on its flat bottom, so supplies that had to stay dried could be stored inside. In addition to the keelboat, the group had smaller boats that were easier to handle, 2 canoes, and a pirogue. A pirogue looked like a big canoe, except it had a mast so it could be sailed as well as rowed. On September 13th, SeaMan was riding up front, on the bow of the keelboat. He sat with his face catching the breeze, his tongue sticking out a little, like a pink half-moon on the black background of his fur. Suddenly, SeaMan raised his head to study a dark, odd-looking cloud in the distant sky. Sniffling, he stood up and began to bark. In a matter of minutes, the sun was completely hidden, turning morning into dusk. But this cloud did not bring rain. It was a cloud of birds. Passenger pigeons were flying overhead in a thick flock. Lewis shook his head at the wonder of it. So many migrating birds, he thought. What animals will we see out west? The skies darkened again on September 15th, this time with rain. It rained for 8 long hours, soaking SeaMan, Lewis, and the men. The smell of wet wood mingled with the smell of wet buckskin clothing. When the rain stopped, another smell appeared, mildew. Lewis checked a few of the supply boxes and found their contents had gotten damp. What was worse, some of the guns were wet and were starting to rust. Lewis groaned. With rusty guns, the men would not be able to hunt. They had to keep the guns in working order. When the boats passed the sunny sandbar 2 days later, Lewis ordered the men to pull up. This will be a good place to spread out the supplies, he said. The men unpacked clothes and blankets and laid them out to dry in the sun. They took apart the guns, wiped them dry, and oiled them to stop the rusting. SeaMan stretched out on the sand and watched the men work. Soon he began to pant in the hot sun. He waded into the river and swam up and down the sandbar. When the dog hopped out and shook himself, water sprayed on the open boxes of supplies. None of the men scolded SeaMan, though. His playful spirit made everybody chuckle. For the rest of the day, SeaMan took turns lying and swimming on the sandbar. He fished for rocks under the shallow water, scooped them up with his mouth, and made a little pile of them on the shore. John Coulter picked up a stick and tossed it into the river. SeaMan leaped into the water after the stick and promptly brought it back in his mouth. Coulter grinned and rubbed SeaMan's wet rump. It took 2 more weeks of river travel to reach Cincinnati. There, Lewis told the men to make camp. He had ordered more supplies to be delivered to them at this town, and the men loaded the boats. SeaMan roped with the men and dozed beside Lewis as he wrote letters. After a few days, they were back on the river, heading southwest. The men set up camp again at Clarksville, where William Clark was living at his brother's home. The plan was for Lewis to go ashore and join Clark, who would be his co-captain in the upcoming expedition. William Clark came running down the steps, his red hair blazing in the sunshine. As he shook hands with Lewis, his eyes danced with excitement. SeaMan watched Lewis's face open into a smile. He saw him grab hold of Clark's hand and shake it warmly. He understood at once that Clark was important, a man to trust and obey. Both Lewis and Clark were tall, about 6 feet, and athletic. Both moved in big, determined strides. They were men in a hurry to get things done, confident men. They climbed the steps and sat on the porch, talking in lively, excited voices. Clark's brother joined them, and the 3 ate and drank, laughing and telling stories. SeaMan lay down patiently at the base of the steps. When the rich smell of cooking meat drifted to him from around the corner of the house, the dog glanced up at Lewis to make sure he was still talking. Then he got up and went to look for the source of that wonderful smell. The door to the kitchen was closed, so SeaMan wandered around the yard. He could hear the men on the porch. SeaMan set out to explore the nearby outbuildings. At one of the barns, SeaMan saw a tall black man at work on some leather straps. The man whistled, and SeaMan approached slowly. Holding out his muscular hands, the man let SeaMan sniff his fingers. They smelled the leather and oil, with a fainter odor of horse fur and hay. "Hello, big fellow," the man said softly. At the sound of the man's voice, SeaMan took a step back. The black man chuckled. "Now don't you act scared of York. Look at the size of those jaws you have. I should be the one who's scared to go near you." SeaMan nuzzled the man's hands. The man stroked Seaman's fur and looked into his deep brown eyes. I bet you'd like to play, wouldn't you, fellow? York jogged into the yard, snatched a stick, and tossed it. Seaman raced after it and brought it back to York. He sat with the stick in his mouth until York took it. Well, you sure know your manners, don't you, fellow? York grinned. He tossed the stick a few more times. Then he walked back to the barn to finish his work. Seaman followed. While York cleaned and hung up the leather straps, Seaman explored the barn and sniffed the wooden stalls. A cat hissed at him and scrambled up a pile of hay. Seaman barked. York chuckled. He rubbed his hands together and wiped them on his pants. As he left the barn, he whistled at Seaman. Come on, big fellow. York walked toward the house, and Seaman bounded alongside his new friend. Ah, here's York, said Clark when he saw the black man walking through the yard. He waved, and York hopped nimbly up the porch steps. Merryweather, do you remember my servant? Yes, I remember York, said Lewis, smiling and clapping his hand on York's shoulder. He's been with you since you were a boy, hasn't he? If my memory serves me, he was a gift from your father, and York's father was a long-time companion and servant to your father. William Clark nodded. You have an excellent memory. Lewis took a long, careful look at York. Although the fellow was tall and muscular, he was as light on his feet as a cat. Lewis said, I'm delighted to see you are enjoying good health, York. Mr. Clark says you're eager to see the West. Yes, sir, said the black man. Master William, he likes to see the world, and York goes wherever Master William goes. York gestured at Seaman. This here dog was wandering around the barns. I haven't seen him before, but he's sure a fine animal. He belonged to you, Mr. Lewis? Lewis beamed. This is SeaMan, the Newfoundland I purchased in Pittsburgh. Lewis turned to Clark as he spoke. I've been well pleased with him. Although he's a young animal, he retrieves game expertly. He's a wonderful swimmer, and he's also quite the hunter. Why, he caught a pile of squirrels for our dinner a few weeks ago. Caught them in the water, snapped their necks, and swam right back to the boat with them. We had quite a feast, thanks to SeaMan. Clark squatted, cupping SeaMan's face in his large hand. There is no finer breed for water travel than a Newfoundland, that's a fact, he said, looking closely at the big black dog. Clark ran his hand over SeaMan's square head and broad back. He felt the dog's muscular legs and thick fur. His smile showed his approval. He's a sound, healthy creature, Merryweather, steady and good-natured. I think he's just the dog for our journey. SeaMan wagged his tail, and Clark smoothed the fluffy fur around the dog's ears. He's a big fellow, though. I'll wager he weighs as much as a man. It's a good thing he knows how to hunt for some of his own groceries. Lewis and Clark spent the next 2 weeks in Clarksville hiring more men. Word had spread about the expedition, and many young men were eager to sign on for the adventure. The captains chose hardy fellows who seemed willing to work, rather than sons of wealthy families. They chose young men who were used to living outdoors, who seemed cheerful and easy to get along with. Finally, a group was chosen, and the boats were loaded. On October 26th, the men pushed off. They headed downstream with the Ohio River's current. The weather was fine. On November 11th, they reached Fort Massac, where they hired a woodsman who knew some Indian languages. They proceeded on. 3 days later, the group made camp at the mouth of the Ohio River, at the place where it flows into the Mississippi, and stayed there a week. Lewis wasn't feeling well. He had chills and fever, and SeaMan stayed close to him as he rested in camp. But when the hunting parties went out to bring back game, John Coulter asked permission to take SeaMan. Lewis agreed. Yes, by all means, he told Coulter. SeaMan can use the exercise, and he's awfully good at retrieving game. Lewis stroked the dog's fur. Go ahead, SeaMan. SeaMan stood up, but he hesitated, looking at Lewis. Go, SeaMan, Lewis said, and he pointed at Coulter. Go with Coulter. SeaMan wagged his tail and ran off beside Coulter. As soon as he was feeling better, Lewis began teaching Clark to pinpoint their location by measuring latitude and longitude. The angle of the sun's shadow had to be recorded at midday, and at night the position of the moon and stars was measured. The readings could only be taken in clear weather. Although making these measurements was difficult and time-consuming, it was important because the expedition would be going into lands that had never been mapped. As the explorers traveled westward, the captains would take measurements every day or two. When the expedition returned, map makers would be able to draw maps of the Northwest using this information in the captains' written reports. The captains took the night measurements after their men had gone to sleep. They used a special instrument, recording every few minutes for an hour or so. Lewis taught Clark how to identify the stars and read the instrument. Together, the pair practiced, one calling out numbers for the other to read. During their evening practice sessions, SeaMan lay beside Lewis and watched the captain's faces. These men were delighted by each other's company. They were so eager to begin their adventure that excitement could be read in the tone of their voices, the set of their jaws, and the spring in their steps. Their mood was contagious. Everybody in the camp felt it, even calm-natured seamen. On the afternoon of November 16th, Lewis left one of the men in charge of the camp and whistled to SeaMan. The dog hopped into the pirogue. Clark pushed off, and the two captains rowed to the western side of the Mississippi River to record the river's width. They pulled the boat onto the bank and hiked through the woods. When they approached a nearby Indian camp, some of the natives strolled over to chat. SeaMan sat patiently at Lewis's side as they talked. One of the Indians held out his hand for SeaMan to smell. The dog did not growl, and the Indian patted SeaMan. He nodded at Lewis and said, "Good, big dog." Lewis smiled. He was proud of SeaMan, so he wanted to show off. "Watch," he said, and he tossed a stick for SeaMan to retrieve. The dog fetched the stick and sat at Lewis's feet. Lewis took the stick and showed it to the Indian. "No teeth marks," he said, displaying the smooth bark. The Indian nodded again. He pointed to a pile of pelts. "3," he said. "3 skins. Good dog, we trade. All beaver skins, very warm. All 3 for 1 dog." The smile faded from Lewis's face, and he turned quite pale. "No trade," he said. "I bought this dog for our expedition. He's worth a lot more than 3 beaver skins." The Indian looked at the pile of pelts as if considering how many he should offer. "No trade," Lewis repeated. He returned to Clark. "Let's go." As the men strode away from the Indian camp, Lewis spoke in an edgy voice. 3 beaver skins? Did the fellow really think I would take 3 beaver skins for my dog? Why, I paid $20 for SeaMan in Pittsburgh. A man doesn't choose just any dog to take along on a voyage to the Pacific Ocean. Look at SeaMan. He's a magnificent animal, as big as a calf and as docile as a kitten. Strong, too, with powerful legs. He swims like an otter. "Merriweather, please," laughed Clark. "The man thought he was making you a generous offer. In his village, 3 beaver skins is probably a princely payment for any dog." "SeaMan is not just any dog," Lewis continued, his words tumbling out. "Did you see the way he handled himself in that village? Not so much as one growl. He never left my side. Sat right down, as patient as a grandmother. Didn't bother the food cooking over the fires. Why, he even ignored the village dogs." Clark threw his big arm around his partner's shoulder. "Merriweather Lewis, I declare you would trade me before you'd part with that dog." Lewis laughed, his face turning pink. "Well, I prize the animal for his qualifications for our journey." "Of course you do, man," Clark said, chuckling. "And well, you should. But the Indian's offer was not an insult. In his way, he was complimenting your choice of a dog." On November 20th, the men loaded the boats to continue their journey. They pushed into the Mississippi River and turned the boats upstream, heading toward the mouth of the Missouri River. After making camp for the winter, they would be traveling upstream on the Missouri for most of their trip west. As soon as the boats turned upstream, the captains knew they had underestimated their task. The boats were heavily loaded with supplies, and the river's current was swift. Although the men were strong and hardy, they were straining against their oars. Going against the current was so difficult that they had to take a zigzag course. They rowed the boats across the river, heading slightly upstream at each crossing, but this method was terribly slow. The boats only traveled about 1 mile upstream in each hour. It was not long before Lewis turned to Clark and spoke in a grim voice. "We're going to need more muscle on our expedition. We need more men." Clark nodded. He had come to the same conclusion. "I know, but more men means we'll need more supplies." "Yes, and more supplies means we'll need more boats, and more hunters to supply us with more game." Lewis frowned. Clark watched Lewis's face. "It's a good thing we discovered this now, Merriweather," he said calmly. Lewis nodded. He shook off his dark mood. After all, he thought with a rush, they were about to begin the greatest adventure in the history of the United States. "That's agreed, then," Lewis said, clapping his hand on Clark's shoulder. "We'll take on more men at the army post at Kaskaskia." The expedition reached Kaskaskia on November 28th. More men were recruited. More supplies were loaded. A spot was chosen for winter camp at the mouth of the Missouri River. By mid-December, the men were building Camp Wood. At first, the winter camp bustled with activity. The men were busy sawing, hammering, and moving supplies. As soon as Camp Wood was complete, the men settled into a routine. Lewis made trips to St. Louis to purchase more supplies, mail letters, and make arrangements. He and Clark talked with traders and trappers who had been up the Missouri River. The captains sketched informal maps of their intended route based on these conversations. Seaman went on hunting trips with John Coulter. He ran beside the men on their training drills. Whenever York had time, he threw sticks into the river for Seaman to retrieve. One of the younger men, George Shannon, wrestled playfully with him. By the middle of March, the Missouri River was free of ice. The days grew warmer, and the men grew restless to begin their adventure. On the morning of March 31st, Lewis and Clark sat together, looking over a list of names. Seaman dozed beside Lewis as the captains talked. When they got up and strode into the open area in the center of Camp Wood, Seaman trotted along next to them. The captains ordered the men to assemble. Seaman watched as the captains announced the names of the men chosen to come on the expedition to the Pacific Ocean. Each man stepped forward as the captains called his name. These men would be the main party of explorers, the Corps of Discovery. The 26 men were chosen to be in the Corps of Discovery. 3 sergeants were announced: Charles Floyd, Nathaniel Pryor, and John Ordway. 9 of the men were from Kentucky, including John Coulter and young George Shannon. 2 of the chosen men were brothers, 2 were cousins, and some were friends. A few of the men had been raised by Indian mothers and could speak a few words of tribal languages. Some of the men had traded with the Indians and knew the sign language used by the tribes that lived along the Missouri River. The group included men who were expert hunters, fishermen, and trappers. There were men who could run a blacksmith forge, build with wood, steer a boat, and play a fiddle. Almost all of the men were in their late 20s or early 30s and unmarried, like their captains. The captain told the rest of the men, a smaller group of about 20, that they would go along for the first part of the journey. The smaller group would return with the scientific notes and samples of plants and animals that were collected during the first leg of the journey. As soon as the announcements were finished, the men chosen to be in the Corps of Discovery whooped with joy. They shook each other's hands and slapped backs all around. George Shannon raced over to Seaman and threw his arms around the big dog's neck. At 18, Shannon was the youngest man to be chosen. Seaman licked Shannon's cheeks, his tail waving back and forth. Although York's name was not read aloud, Clark put his hand on the black man's shoulder and said he would be part of the Corps of Discovery. York broke into a little jig, and John Coulter grinned and clapped his hands. Barking happily, Seaman romped around the group. Lewis and Clark watched the merriment, beaming like proud fathers. Soon, the Lewis and Clark expedition would begin.